Okay. Yeah. So good afternoon. Okay. Thank you all so much for being here today on a beautiful day. And if you don't know me, I think you all know me. If you don't know me, I'm Feng Shenghu, the Richard G. Engelsman Dean of Arts and Sciences. And it's an honor to welcome you to the installation of William Maxwell as the Fannie Hurst Professor of Creative Literature. It's so great to see many friends. Wow, background music.
I did request music for the.
Do I have to read?
I think we're going to take it.
Okay. It's so great to see many friends and familiar faces from the WashU community here today. And a big welcome to everyone joining us via our live stream. Thank you all for being here to be part of this special moment. We are especially delighted to have several of Bill's family members in the audience. They include Julia Walker, his wife, who is also a distinguished professor in arts and sciences, a professor of English and a professor of performing arts. And Julia is currently the chair of the Performing Arts Department. We also have Bill's sister, Stephanie Maxwell, and brother-in-law, Christian Tremblay, whom I just met a few minutes ago, and they flew all the way from Austin, Texas, to join us today. Thank you all so much. Please stand to be recognized. As we all know, higher education is going through a tough and unpredictable period. So a formal ceremony like this might seem a little out of sync, but to me, that is exactly why it matters. When things feel rough and uncertain, it's even more important to come together and remind ourselves what we stand for. And that's why today's event really means something. It's about more than honoring a remarkable scholar, a wonderful colleague, and a generous donor. It's a celebration of a strong, creative, and committed community in arts and sciences. Professorship installation ceremonies are, without a doubt, one of my favorite traditions at WashU. They bring us together to recognize the incredible work of our faculty and the generosity of those whom help make it possible as we work together to achieve our ambitious goal, making arts and sciences a global model in research, teaching, and scholarship. And that brings me to the person we are here to celebrate today, Professor Bill Maxwell. Bill is a professor of literature in our departments of English and African American Studies. His teaching and research explore the ties between Black writing and US political history. Bill has had a long and distinguished academic career. Before arriving at WashU in 2009, Bill taught at the University of Geneva and the College of William and Mary, and also at the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign. We actually overlapped there, but that wasn't the reason he got hired here, and that wasn't the reason I got hired here. So, Bill was elected president of the Modernist Studies Association in 2021 and has served on the Modern Language Association's divisional committees on both Black African and 20th century African literatures. Bill has published 5 books on African American literature and dozens of essays in academic and popular journals. And in just a few minutes, you're going to hear a lot more about Bill's outstanding accomplishments from Abraham Van Engen and Gerald Early. And now I would like to turn our attention to the namesake of this professorship and the gift that made it possible. This professorship was established in 1969 by a generous bequest from the estate of Fannie Hurst. The professorship honors her legacy as a distinguished American novelist and short story writer whose works were popular during the post-World War II, post-World War I era. She was one of the most widely read female authors of the 20th century. Hurst was a St. Louisan who attended WashU and graduated in 1909. Truly remarkable. And Abel and I were just talking about, so who else grew up in St. Louis and became a famous writer? And clearly we know Tennessee Williams and T.S. Eliot. So I think Abram's going to create a course featuring the authors growing up in St. Louis, and he's going to teach it by himself. So during her last term here at WashU, she wrote the book and lyrics for a comic opera called The Official Chaperone, which was performed on campus. After graduation, Hurst moved to New York City to pursue a writing career. Throughout her life, she also actively worked and spoke on behalf of social justice organizations and causes supporting feminism and African American civil rights. So she really was far ahead of time in so many ways. Over her nearly 6-decade career, she published many best-selling books, more than 300 short stories, and several Broadway plays. In addition, she received an honorary degree from WashU alongside T.S. Eliot in 1953. So we are so grateful for the generosity of Fannie Hurst, whose legacy continues to help us recruit and retain some of the world's most talented and best scholars at WashU, and that includes Bill Maxwell. And now I would like to invite Abraham Van Ingen to the podium, and then after that it will be Joel Early to talk about Bill and his many contributions.
Hi all, it's good to see you all here today, and what a joy it is to be able to celebrate Bill and all Bill is and brings to our department. It's my job to introduce him, and it's very fitting that the three of us are. I think Gerald was part of hiring Bill, and Bill was on the search team that hired me, so it all just comes full circle here. For anyone who doesn't know all that Bill has accomplished, I just want to lay out a few things here, just to get us oriented. His first book, New Negro, Old Left, came out in 1999, and it established his reputation as a leading scholar of African American literature and modernism. And then what followed was a whole series of articles and edited work that led to this singularly marvelous and extraordinary book, FBI's How J. Edgar Hoover's Ghost Readers Framed African American Literature, which was named a Choice Outstanding Academic Book title, Book of the Week for San Francisco Chronicle and Publishers Weekly, a Best Book by The Economist, shortlisted for the Modernist Studies Association Prize, and won the 2016 American Book Award. It's a heck of a book. And that book, in turn, led to the release of even more material, including making public and making available, both digitally and in print, several FBI files on important Black writers of the 20th century that Bill meticulously recovered through Freedom of Information Act requests. In fact, in 2017, Simon & Schuster published the entire file on James Baldwin, which Bill edited and made possible. Bill does not just the important scholarly work of discovery and insight and argumentation, he also does the important scholarly work of recovery and editing and resource creation, including releasing the complete poems of Claude McKay and a recovered last novel of McKay, which he edited and released with Penguin Classics. The work mounts up. One thing after another. And these are just the basics of his scholarly profile. They don't even touch on his teaching and service to the wider profession. So now I'm just citing achievements and accomplishments, but let me say a word more about his book, FBI's, before they get the hook and yank me out of here. I have just really two simple criteria that I take to any talk or book or article. The first is, have I learned something from this? And the second is, can I explain what I learned to my wife? It's not a huge high bar, but it is a bar that not everybody always meets. But let's just say that having taught Bill's book in Intro to Grad Studies, he has more than surpassed that bar. The insights keep coming, and I remember going home and teaching this book and going home and saying to Kristen, yeah, but he says this, and this is the thing, this. And it's the clarity as well of the book, the prose quality in that book, which make it a rare achievement and an absolute model for our students. It's one of the reasons why the book has been reviewed in at least 55 US journals and magazines, 55. The important one in Bill's fields, of course, but also big general reader ones like Harper's and The Economist. My favorite journal to review it is this one, the CIA Intelligence Officer's Bookshelf. Who knew? They didn't like it. They didn't like it. It's incredible. Someone should tell them that they didn't know we didn't know they existed. Beyond the US, it has been featured and reviewed in Brussels, London, Birmingham, Madrid, Valencia, Brazil, Belgium, Bogota, Hamburg, Amsterdam, Tel Aviv, Poland, Accra, Shanghai, Istanbul, and elsewhere. Citations work a little differently in the humanities than they do in the sciences, but there are good reasons why, according to the AD Scientific Index, Bill Maxwell is the most cited professor in our department. I could talk endlessly about Bill's work, but let me close by dwelling on a simple point made in FBIs. In the 20th century, some of the closest and most attentive readers of African American literature were FBI agents. Just think about that for a second. These agents read Black novels and poems and plays to surveil African Americans, to keep tabs, to keep watch. Now, this is definitely creepy, and it's certainly worrying, but it also reveals something we should not miss. In the 20th century, the US government knew that literature matters. It shapes us, changes us, motivates us, makes us who we are as a people or a culture or a nation. And one of the many things I love about Bill Maxwell is that this mattering of literature, of our work in English, is right on the surface. A graduate student, one hopes, already knows that the work of studying literature matters. Our majors, one presumes, know this as well. But if they ever come to a place of doubt, they should talk to Bill. Anyone who meets Bill or takes a class with Bill or finds their writing minutely and carefully annotated by Bill will know that the work we do matters. Which is why perhaps when Bill took over as director of undergraduate studies several years ago, the major started turning around and has been rising ever since. The passions of Bill Maxwell, which many of us have experienced firsthand, run very deep. But they are also always right on the surface. Passion comes from caring, and caring comes because something is at stake. What's true in Bill's scholarship is true in his teaching, it's true in his work as a colleague in the department, it's true in his work as a steadfast public servant in the profession. I can't emphasize this enough. Our profession, what we do, our department, who we are, our fields of learning in American literature and African American literature, what we know, it is all made better and stronger and richer in and through the work, care, insight, commitments, and abiding passion of this person I so deeply admire, Bill Maxwell.
It's better. Good afternoon, everyone. I first met Bill Maxwell in the mid-1990s when I ran a series of conferences called the Black Heartland. The conferences examined Black life and culture in the Midwest. Bill, as I recall, responded to a call for papers. He was an associate professor at the University of Illinois then. I did not know who he was. I cannot say that I organized these conferences very well, so I had no idea why he was willing to participate. I am very glad he did. Some good people showed up at the conferences, but Bill was the smartest, the most perceptive of all of them. His presence alone made me think the conferences were worth doing. I was attracted to his work, of course, because he was a literary critic, as I profess to be. But he was specifically a literary historian with great command of a range of intellectual resources and an ability to deploy those resources with supremely scholarly dexterity. For instance, I was floored by his discussion of lyricist Andy Rassif, most famous for writing the words to the song, "What Did I Do to Be So Black and Blue?" in his discussion in Bill's first book, New Negro, Old Left, African American Writings and Communism Between the Wars. His sections on Rassif made me rethink the nature of both Black commercial music and Black music criticism that occurred during the Harlem Renaissance. It was a tour de force blend of American literary history, African American cultural history, American pop culture history, Black international political history, and just smart analysis. I can't do that, I thought, but I'm glad somebody can. Bill displayed all of this, let's call it scholarly daring do, when he came to my Black Heartland conferences, which was before New Negro, Old Left was published. Because of our shared interest in Black American literature and Black American music, especially jazz, dovetailed, I considered him a kindred soul. I was also struck by Bill's irreverent and irrepressible sense of humor. He could fire off one-liners as well as Henny Youngman. Well, let's say an academic Henny Youngman. If the guy leaves academia, I thought, he could become a comedy writer. He has the impulse to mock the comfortable, including academics. Bill has become one of the major academic voices on 20th century Black American literature, running the gamut from the Harlem Renaissance and figures like Andy Rassif and Claude McKay to the Depression era of Richard Wright and Zora Neale Hurston and the Civil Rights Movement era of Ralph Ellison and James Baldwin. His angles have always been remarkable and unexpected. How FBI investigators read Black literature of the 1960s, or his current project of the rebirth of James Baldwin in American cultural memory. How was Black literature affected by government agents seriously reading and misreading writers like Eldridge Cleaver and Amiri Baraka as part of their relentless surveillance of Blacks? Why is Baldwin so revered now when he was so neglected in the years immediately following his death? For instance, Baldwin's visit to Washington University in 1984, a few years before his death, went nearly unnoticed and largely unremarked at the time. Bill Maxwell's work has grappled with these issues. He has filled many gaps in African American literary history, filled gaps in how people, both Black and white, friend and foe, have seen and used this body of literature. In a sense, his work is about the ventures of misreading Black American literature for good and ill. His dedication to understanding the uses of and abuses inflicted upon African American literature, or what makes a usable African American literature, not just to Blacks, but to the reformed anti-racist mission and identity of this hard nation, is what he is all about. This made his work as crucial to African American studies as it is to the English department. And that is why we are here today, to recognize and reward an astonishing body of scholarship that has had a broad impact. Everybody's a critic, the old saying goes, but good literary criticism is singularly hard to do. Bill is one of the best. There is a well-worn story about the old vaudevillian who, as he was expiring, said to his grieving colleagues, "Dying is easy, comedy is hard." Bill's wit makes me think that comedy may be easier for him than for many. It is probably what I like most about him, how he amuses by mocking the comfortable and comforting the wrongly mocked. The man is smart and ethical. That is why I am glad, honored to call Bill Maxwell my friend and colleague.
come here.
Okay. Thank you.
I think you all know that speaking after Abraham and Gerald is just hopeless, right? But the only person that I know who can surpass them will be this guy.
Thanks to
No
set me up.
pressure.
Nothing. All right.
So, Bill, I'm delighted to present you with this beautiful medallion. The front says, Fannie Hurst, Professor of Creative Literature, Washington University, 1853, Arts and Sciences. Engraved on the back, it says, William J. Maxwell, April 24th, 2025. And another thing that Bill is going to surpass all previous recipients of such beautiful things will be to keep this on 24/7.
It could happen. How do we do this? All right, thank you. Thank you so much. Thank you. Congratulations. All right. Oh, that's how we do it. Okay. Thank you. Wow. Now I have to make a speech, okay, which is going to be okay. So I haven't won a medal since I placed third in a 5K in the over 60. But that alone was one of the proudest moments of my life. And so this so far surpasses it, particularly since I haven't had an emotional meltdown, which is coming. But in any case, here I've got slides. I never use slides. There it is. All right. Julia did that. Okay. So anyway, I was wondering what it was going to feel like when people come up and say nice things about you in this kind of almost post-funereal way. It's like, I've been talking to friends today. They were trying to make me feel better. And I said, it's kind of like attending your own eulogy. But anyway, no, it's okay. It's not bad. I'm going to continue. We have people to fight that we need to survive. Okay. Anyway, so Thoreau instructs us in Walden, where else, to beware of all enterprises that require new clothes, and not rather a new wearer of clothes. Yet this occasion, requiring a new suit on an old guy, I only have one kind of suit, it's always a blue striped suit, turns out to be gratifying so far. Let me share the enjoyment with some unburdening thanks. I owe these to everyone here, I'm sure, and I want to applaud you and thank you for coming. Okay. I know the food's attractive, you know, and I like a glass of wine, so, you know, I don't know what your motives are, but I'm glad that you're here. But I'm going to mention a few people by name, and this is the hard part emotionally, but I'll mention by name Dean Fengsheng Yu, who's been an incredibly steady and important supporter of the English department. And he, as he mentioned, he's a fellow veteran of the Prairie to City, University of Illinois to WashU, right? Urbana-Champaign, my friend. It's an excellent university, but it's in a somewhat different region. Anyway, so we both did that. Abram Van Engen, shockingly well preserved for someone of his academic stature. I don't know what he's doing, but I was like, man, I need to stand more upright. Anyway, has been an always honorable department head and inspiring intellectual cousin once removed. We do very different things, but I'm always inspired with what he does. Maybe some range things we have in common. And an indulgent friend who has never shut his office door to me, even when he really should. Right? Okay. Gerald Early, for his part, a mentor for more than 30 years. More than 30 years. He's been one of the most important people in my entire life, I think it's fair to say. He's the primary reason I'm anywhere near this room today. In the spring of 1992, still a graduate student, and Gerald was talking about this, I took my first ever visit to both Washington University and the city of St. Louis to participate in a symposium Gerald had organized on Black life in the Midwest, there were a few of those. I think I was at the most literary one. But it was interesting, you brought us to some jazz concerts. We saw, John Lewis. Amazing. Okay. His kind words about my paper fed me for 2 years as I dissertated, far from my American subject, in underfurnished rooms in Geneva, Switzerland. That was interesting. That was the one thing that made me actually finish. Because I had about 50 books, and otherwise I would have researched forever. Anyway, an inventor of Black cultural studies before the fact, Gerald continues to motivate me as I try to cut the differences between the article and the essay. The academic and the literate public audience as finally imaginary as these collectives are. Without these three gentlemen, Dean Yu and Abram and Gerald, my chances of squirming and quelling under this medal would be slim. That's a little, never mind. Some of you know what that means. Without Beth Ackerman and her team of organizers and the staff of the Whittemore House, meanwhile, I'd be at the wrong place at the wrong time, awaiting the wrong hors d'oeuvres. And by the way, you're going to get those in about 35 minutes. So let's please give everybody a hand who organized this thing. It's great. And there are, yeah, it breaks your heart. There are a few other people, those with whom I share a greater degree of genetic information, some of them in the room, most of them from places outside St. Louis, I really want to thank as well. And this is the hard part emotionally. On the coming from outside St. Louis front, a very brief anecdote. When I excitedly told my father, a very cosmopolitan, but also very Jersey guy, that I had been offered a job at WashU, he replied with a question, "Billy, is that the one with the arch?" It's like, he had been to Chicago. Anyway, wait, why are they showing? We need the slides. Okay, that's him, William III, the one on the right of the first black and white pair to your left. He and my mother, Angela Giardina, the daughter of immigrants from the sulfur mining town of Caltanissetta, Sicily, are pictured exchanging vital information at the college where they met, the New Jersey State Teachers College at Jersey City, sometime in the late 1950s. I think it might be like 1956. Both were the first in their working class families to seek higher education, and both became public school teachers. My mother, the fourth grade boss, whom students feared, parents loved, and ex-students wound up visiting. That one, right? The one who teaches you to write, say. With hand-ups from the golden age of the American welfare state, my Scottish-German father rose from third-generation Hoboken longshoreman to drafted Korean War infantryman to middle school social studies chair, didn't let us forget that one, to EDD professor of American history, to brilliant administrator at his Jersey City alma mater. And I say that, we're all proud, right? But he was an incredible administrator, and I respect good administration. I do. No, we've had really good luck with administrators in the English department for a long time, and I really do appreciate it. And with our dean who supports us. Okay. They'd be proud of me and themselves if here today, right? It was like, we did this. And would be whispering to each other throughout a bit too loudly with the intensity the old pictures suggest. You'd be hearing my mother right now. As some of you have reason to suspect, I'm not always capable of appropriate silence. Or innocent of bouts of temper and other sudden waves of feeling. It's one of my specialties. It seems a cliche, not to mention a betrayal of my post-identitarian commitments, to attribute my expressive impulses and elevated emotional thermostat to my Italian mom. She preferred that national adjective to Sicilian. But her ready words and gesturing hands, have you noticed? Our hair is similar, or it used to be. Captured in the photo had their sway. I was her student as well. She taught us to read, right? And I helplessly channel her when I'm reading a good poem or monograph or listening to moving music. Thanks, Mom, for the literally painful piano lessons taught by a German teacher who kept bending our thumbs. Or when struggling to think the truth out loud. Speaking of the truth said out loud, the pair at center really is me and my sister, Stephanie Maxwell Tremblay, who's sitting there right now, caught in mid-teenage in the Roman Colosseum. We weren't there constantly. I mean, we did. We did not hang out there or anything. It wasn't like the after-school special. But our mother preferred we visit that before we went anywhere near Sicily. And we went to Sicily thanks to Stephanie's generosity much later. So the 70s hair volume has gone, but the comradeship remains. We both inherited our parents' enthusiasm for art and travel, museums, and importantly, museum cafes. My mother thought they were a good deal. Some of my favorite moments with my mother were at museum cafes. But I've been uniquely blessed by Steph's frankness, generosity, lightning-quick executive skills, and uncanny talent for snagging Springsteen tickets. I think it involves both luck and money, but anyway, it's good. She and her welcoming and knowledgeable husband, Christian Tremblay, you should ask him about your wine choices after the speech. He's trained. Have made the journey up from Austin, Texas, and they deserve their own hand too. And then there are my cousins, 8 removes. No. And then there's the final pair at right, whom most of you will recognize. The young man of the duo, Bix, once a regular sampler of Dunker Hole cheese plates, he grew up on those things. He liked to come to lectures to eat, basically, is now picking up William III's mantle as a William and Mary history major. He has the good fortune of resembling his mother, Julia Walker, smiling at the right, more than his father in all the unsuperficial ways. They're even-keeled, these two, and determined and incapable of blaming others for anything in their line of sight. Julia, the member of the duo, who I know a little bit longer, also happens to be a person of indelible grace and meditative philosophical intelligence. 2 things I wish I had more of. A rarely theatrical theater scholar, she's been since 1990, my final editor when I'm either writing or living. Without her, I wouldn't be myself, let alone someone with a fortunate academic career. And that's the other, I've just been really lucky. And I'll tell you how later. But anyway, while Bix couldn't be here in person, his junior year finals approacheth, Julia is on hand. Please help me embarrass her by giving her another hand, too. I know. Okay. And then there's Joao, who deserves the tilde. Okay. But enough about them. I like the slides. I should use slides. Okay, but enough about them. People who've taught with me, some of them are sitting here, realize how difficult it is for me to operate the computer. So thank you for your help along the years. But enough about them. Let's talk about me, and more interestingly, the making of certain me's through certain others. Fannie Hurst's 1958 autobiography. We're going to talk a lot about Fannie Hurst. The modestly named Anatomy of Me. Begins with, this is one of the reasons she was famous, begins with a caution against its own rhyming title. The chasms in the path of the autobiographer, her first sentence reads, lead to pitfalls of egotism and egoism. And I want to ask her what exactly she meant by that difference, but I don't know. Quickly shifting gears and figures of speech, her overtures do this habitually. She then customizes through a domesticating simile, a proclamation of Caesar's, the most famous one, she may have learned while at WashU. This is her language. The autobiography of I saw, I did, I came, I went, lifts from the pages of memory as easily as a cake from its greased pan. That's good. Okay. It's tempting on this ego-feeding occasion to ignore Hurst's warning and extract only the self-made record of the scholarly eye. Part of me even wants to go the way of Flaubert on Madame Bovary and declare that Fannie Hurst, c'est moi. We have a few things in common, you'll notice, except for her far greater talent, wealth, and fame. But there are some similarities. The temptation, when I heard that this was I was so pleased to win this, of course, to get this time. But when I heard it was Fannie Hurst, I was like, that's perfectly appropriate. Both for the good reasons and some of the reasons we'll discuss later. But anyway, the temptation of moi aside, it's considerably more accurate to say that at WashU, Fannie Hurst say nous, she's us. She's in all of us, having formed many of us, notably those of us who've taught, studied, or read in the vicinity of the WashU English department. It's her name, an original $1 million bequest, which that's like $6 million in contemporary, money, at least before yesterday or whatever. An original $1 million bequest behind the Hearst Lounge on the second floor of Dunker Hall. The rooms surveyed by 4 angels where pretty much everyone in the literary business has at one time or another, and I'm not exaggerating, come to announce a book or win a job since the 1970s. It's an incredible parade. It's her stamp on the visiting Hurst professorships that have for half a century drawn hundreds of good writers and critics to St. Louis, presenting a visiting history of Anglophone letters in progress. It's been a tremendous boon to our university and our department. It's the books of her personal library. I borrowed some. I have returned them. One half of these went to WashU, the other to Brandeis, the home of another Hurst lounge. She gave half her fortune to Brandeis. That helped to fill the shelves in the English department's main office. And it's her life-size, somewhat ghostly portrait, all pale gown and calla lily, that commands a wall in Mary Jo Bang's office. Some of you may have seen it on Dunker's first floor, a blockbusting realist novelist visiting a remarkable avant-garde poet. It's an interesting conjunction. Yet despite us making ubiquity, a vanishing number of people on campus or elsewhere remember her own writerly legacy. 18 novels, 8 story collections. Actually, some of these figures are somewhat disputed, depends how you count things. 5 plays and countless articles deep. It's a lot. Okay. As Dean Yu outlined, for most of the early 20th century, from the early 20s to the early 60s, Fannie Hurst ranked among the best paid, best publicized, most prolific, and most outspoken creative writers and liberal activists in the United States. For her, those 2 careers were very much, in alignment. Her hundreds of short stories out-earned everyone's but F. Scott Fitzgerald, who name-checked her snidely and jealously in This Side of Paradise, a novel I bet some of you have read, one of the great college novels. Her best-selling novels translated into 14 different languages were the subjects of Hollywood bidding wars, from Lummox, these are all novels, Lummox to Backstreet to the racial passing spectacle Imitation of Life. I'll be talking about that, made into hit films in both 1934 and 1959. Her companionate marriage to the Russian emigre pianist Jock Danielson, she kept her name, her apartment, and her own social schedule, which was scandalous at the time, contributed a new feminist term to the American language, the Fannie Hurst marriage. Not exactly in our slang vocabulary now, but in mid-century, it was a real thing. Her public speaking and fundraising for the New Deal were powerful enough to win her places on the National Housing Committee, set up by Roosevelt, and at the Roosevelt's private dining table. More than once, she joked that she had slept in every room at the White House, with the possible exception of the presidents and the first ladies. That's her joke. Okay. But as you know, I can't resist those. In the years surrounding her death at 79 in 1968, however, with the New Deal transformed into an embattled Great Society and sentimental tolerance fully installed as institutional modernism's easiest target, Hearst's reputation plummeted, and she became the butt of not great, not unmisogynist jokes. The theme song of Mel Brooks' 1970 film, The 12 Chairs. Has anyone ever seen that? For example, a parody of Russian realism and Soviet cynicism contains these immortal lines. Hope for the best, expect the worst. You could be Tolstoy or Fannie Hurst. Mel. Anyway, Hurst had no living relatives left to challenge her demotion to high culture's vulgar American opposite, and few living critics have volunteered since. New modernist canons and syllabi, increasingly democratized since the 1990s, and there are people in this room who did important work to do this, have opened to almost every modern with a manuscript besides her. In the remainder of my talk this afternoon, yes, there's a remainder, okay, I'll just try to tell part of her story as she wrote and lived it. Fannie Hurst c'est elle, that's her and hers, a story worth telling. Taking it up allows me to entertain several of the interests I've pursued throughout my writing and teaching, charting, okay, what are those? Charting alternative modernisms of all kinds, particularly those of U.S. radical literatures, and testing the uses of more or less Marxian cultural biography, that's basically my mode, as a wide-angle lens exposing larger movements in social and political history. As we'll see, Hurst's biographical story is, in its best-known chapter writ large, the drama of the non-African American African Americanist. Restoring aspects of her to memory, then, invites me to address the white elephant in the room, something I've rarely discussed in public, like pretty conscientious. I mean, like, after 5, I talk about it, but I think the most boring thing in the world is for white people to talk about this. But anyway, something I've rarely discussed in public, my race in relationship to my work on Black writing, the thing that everybody wants to know about, but practically everyone is too polite to ask. So, yeah, there she is. That's young Fannie Hurst, just out of Washington University. Okay, Fannie Hurst, who never made perfect peace with her inelegant given name, was born on a farm in Ohio in 1885 and raised a St. Louis city kid. She spent her first conscious years as a writer in a still-standing frame house at Cates Avenue, just north of what's now the Delmar Divine on the Delmar Divide. You probably have passed this house. Her parents, Samuel and Rose Hurst, were German-descended Jews armored by their American patriotism and vocal distaste for the freshly arrived, less assimilated East European Jews she eventually made a literary specialty, which is a very interesting irony. Dashes of Yiddish were spoken at home, but when Fannie asked about the principles of her family's ancient faith, cut! Actually, that's a good joke, but not in this context. Okay. So this is what I was trying to say is, like, Fanny's growing up in this Jewish family, and she asks, what do we believe? What is our tradition? They sent her to the public library, said, do your own research. So it gives you a sense of there's a secular family. Samuel, at the height of his career, entered the most St. Louis-y of businesses and ran a shoe factory. There's nothing more St. Louis than that, from that part of the world anyway, from that part of our history. Standard Heel and Counter, ascending to a higher rank than Tennessee Williams' father, a mere division manager at International Shoe on Washington Avenue. From the lofty perspective of Central Park West, the mature Fannie liked to describe her girlhood as a Midwestern idol of tedious ease, a frozen chronotope tucked, this is her language, she explained, into the drowsy pre-modern world of phony security which antedated the world wars. But the truth was less comfortably sleepy. Hearst biographer Brooke Kroger, there's a very good Fannie Hurst biography that I recommend, discovered that her family moved to the solid house on Cates Avenue only with Samuel's success at Standard Heel, an event of Fannie's late adolescence. Before then, there were displacements to at least 11 boarding houses, 2 major business failures, and continuous exposure to the alternating booms and panics of a pre-regulated Gilded Age capitalism, the erratic, unforgiving system we've been busy reconstructing since January, with an added layer of dictatorial madness. Truer words. Okay. Fannie's autobiography, concentrating her family's many moves into one adventure in group living, offers a tribute to a single innkeeper, a Mrs. Cleveland, whose husband's library included a translation of Plutarch's Lives. And I know there's some classicists in the house. This is a hilarious detail. It was a book recommended to Jewish tenants, Hurst recounts, on the faulty assumption that its Greek Platonist author had never heard of Christianity. Safe. Okay. Fannie took greater pleasure in 19th century European novels, including Dickens' David Copperfield and Balzac's Pere Goriot, their romantic realism a lifelong touchstone, despite her experiments in hypermetaphorization and syntactical fragmentation. Modernist ruptures we associate with high modernism. She sprinkled lightly into pot-boiling social melodramas. So she was touched by modernist style at times. She never admitted that Dickens' childhood crash landing from comfort to poverty was itself a reference point, but her 50-plus years of narrative fiction often focused on laboring women, the kind that could be found in the smaller rooms at Mrs. Cleveland's, told a different story. What she later cast as novel-building episodes of immersive slumming, she writes a lot about slumming, actually, were encouraged by the prospect of supplemental pay. Weeks spent pulling shifts beside immigrant girls in shoe factories, garment sweatshops, and cheap cafeterias, the settings of her best adult writing, were not at first strictly adventures in ethnography. Into some of the flushest years for the Hearsts came Washington University. You've heard of it. which Fannie chose in part because her mother couldn't stand the thought of her leaving St. Louis for the pioneering journalism school at Mizzou, which was truly her desire, but it didn't happen. At 20, Fannie joined WashU's class of 1909, the first to enjoy the Gothic-style quad around Brookings Hall, still there, originally built for the World's Fair. She was one of just 20 women in a first-year cohort of 109 students at a time when only 10% of eligible American women enrolled in college anywhere. Her father, writing the tuition checks, agreed with his willful, striving daughter that knowledge is power. It was his favorite saying. But he also did his best to make her see her exceptionality as a latent hazard. That Washington University, he grumbled, is an old maid's nest. Fannie, this is in her autobiography. I'm not saying, that's so silly. Okay, but this is not that long ago, right? It's in living memory for some people, some of us old people. Fannie took refuge in the just opened all-white women's dormitory in McMillan Hall. These days, perhaps a little too fittingly, the site of both our women, gender, and sexuality studies and African American studies departments that are fundamental to what we do. She roomed on the top floor of the 4-story Gothic tower, the tower sitting right there on the quad. She called it the test tube, where she looked down methodically at a campus she planned to conquer with her typewriter. English classes were encouraging, especially a lecture on the major Elizabethan poets. Joe Lowenstein, are you here? There you go. Okay. That was after you. That inspired a mosque in blank verse. I thought that was interesting. But she compiled a B- average overall and thought herself more conspicuous than distinguished. That was her term as a student. Her distinctive talent, as she then saw it, lay in drama as well as poetry and fiction. In her final year, as Dean Yu noted, she created a 2-act operetta for Washington University's senior class show called The Official Chaperone, based on the unheroic subject of the troubles had in securing lenient monitors for school dances. So think Footloose, roughly, but for mid-American Edwardians. She got there first. There should be royalties. But don't worry, she made a lot of money. It's okay. More substantial than the operetta itself were the student protests it generated. The cast and their supporters, Fannie, never shy, gave herself the lead role. She also appeared on Broadway from time to time. Demanded the right to appear on stage in ballet costumes, Brooke Kroger reports. The administration and scandalized parents objected. And in the end, the young actresses were made to retreat into stiffened skirts. By 1915, 6 years after graduation, she was informing reporters that, quote, the 2 great waves sweeping the working classes to freedom were socialism and women's liberation. Despite her open delight in her growing affluence, lots of reporters were asked to photograph her apartment, which she decorated with old world antiques. The advances of the new woman and the new worker, she had been both, were never separable in her political imagination. There she is. Okay. By the same year, 1915 or so, Hearst's agents were boasting at times sincerely that she was the best paid magazine writer in the world. Running away to New York in 1910, under cover of attending graduate courses at Columbia, I made pretty much the same move 70 years later. She began writing 6 or more hours a day and selling plot-driven stories of tenement yards, department store clerks, and picturesque strains between first and second immigrant generations. As sensitively summarized by William Dean Howells, the Dean of American Literary Realism, her short fiction, snapped up by the likes of Cosmopolitan and the Saturday Evening Post, explored quote-unquote Hebraic comedy to plumb depths of true and beautiful feeling. It's a self-canceling statement. One of the first stories Fannie placed in a national magazine, which was called Romance on Casserole. No, it's actually a good story. Published in Cavalier in 1912, was typical in both its blunt quotidian detail, the casserole, and mawkish Dickensian plot, the romance. Aggie, a young Manhattan waitress skilled at balancing plates while escaping from male customers' wandering hands, must choose between two marriage proposals, one from a steadily employed boor, the other from a handsome but seemingly broke social worker, who is in truth a wealthy freelance intellectual. It's like your uncle has left you a fortune. Your wealthy freelance intellectual on a Jacob Riis-style field trip to document how the other half lives. Making what she assumes is the safe choice of money over love, Aggie fails to notice when her Rockefeller in rags, walking off in dejection, climbs into a waiting limousine stashed around the corner. In her practical calculation, she has unknowingly rejected her suitor's upright life of luxury, not to mention the preferred identity of her creator, one Fannie Hurst, who aspired to become the precise artistic equivalent of a compassionate social worker with the chauffeured ride. Hurst, that's what she was, basically. Hurst's vehicle to fame and fortune, she later reflected, was the anonymous mass, this is her language, of toiling women flowing along Broadway like slow molasses, who, her language again, if killed in a plane crash, were designated as others. She would give them individual if common names, these Smiths and Jones and Cohens, but she would not condemn them to dreams of indistinction. They too could think and be rich in preferred ambits of desire. To cite another artist of the working class, lyricist John King of the Gang of Four, of course, Fannie unmasked the distilled wisdom of women on the 8-hour clock. To hell with poverty. To hell with poverty. From one angle, at our 100-year distance, her schmaltzy naturalism makes her look like a kind of art monster in reverse. Not a great avant-gardist with noxious politics and a track record of abuse, but a respectably woke voice, responsibly raised for some of the right causes with an unforgivably corny style. From another equally telling angle, however, Hurst's work nowadays looks like some of the most cannily influential proletarian literature ever produced in the United States. Her audience was composed in no small part by the crowds she wrote about, the millions of young, unmarried American women, many the children of new citizens who joined the urban workforce in the decades after 1910, crowds that contained both of my grandmothers, one of whom sewed in addition to fixed hair, one of whom was a secretary who used the public library like nobody's business. Anyway, I miss these people. Back. Okay. Her fiction found its lucrative groove in Bleeding Within 4, the single working girl, Hurst testified. And that working girl shelled out for her in turn. Unlike the consciously Marxist party-approved varieties of proletarian writing that galvanized American literary debates during the Great Depression, Hurst's version was as popular as it was populist. Of and for actually existing wage-earning women, frank in its depiction of chosen pleasures and everyday sexual harassment. She wrote about that a lot. Her stuff was eagerly consumed by the massive proletarian audience the editors of the new masses mostly only dreamed of. Okay. This is a really good novel, by the way. I recommend. We have a copy in the main office. Don't steal it. Okay. Image of the novel Lummox. That's my slide. Hurst, a salon semi-socialist rather than a wordy communist in the company of Richard Wright or Lillian Hellman, understood this irony well. And so revealingly did Leon Trotsky, the most literary of the Russian Bolsheviks, who made proletarian art the global watchword, of the early 20th century cultural left. Hurst, received by Trotsky for a private interview outside Moscow in 1924, importantly, the year Lenin died, and the succession struggle in the Soviet Union is coming to a head. She goes to visit him, and she discovers that the single book on his neat desk was a copy of her ambitious new novel, Lummox. It traced the basement-to-grave saga of Bertha, an inarticulate Baltic cleaning woman, her inner life nothing like her clumsy handle, and some of you know this, but that's what Lummox means. It means clumsy, a clumsy person. Born on a New York dock and raped by her waspy employer's effete poetic son, right? So it's about sexual violence. It's an allegory of different sorts of literary visions and ranks. It's very gendered in that way. It's really an interesting novel. And And the project of the novel is basically, I'm going to show you what people think about who you think can't express themselves, right? It's interesting. Okay, so anyway, I'm a great admirer of your work, Trotsky told Hurst in the broken English he had learned when exiled to Fannie's territory on the Lower East Side. He lived on the Lower East Side for a couple of months. Lummox, he managed to pronounce. It's a hard word. I know so well I can recite most of it from memory. She shifted uncomfortably after he launched with near photographic accuracy into the meat of an early chapter. Was it right? He interrupted himself to ask. This is her account anyway. I don't know, Hurst confessed. You will have to let me hold the book to see for sure. Trotsky, at least, was not about to continue he was not about to confine his modern English intake to the great men of 1922 or to lesser Cubo-futurists of the factory floor. To his exacting mind, then mainly turned to running the Red Army, pretty big job, Hearst's egalitarian sentimentality, the usual sin condemned in Scribbling Women, right? I believe that's Hawthorne. Did I get that right? 19th century? Okay. Only enhanced her virtues as a memorably effective proletarian author. Strange as it seems, the leader of the Soviet left opposition was captivated and impressed by what my graduate advisor, Jane Tompkins, later called sentimental power, the monumental effort of sentimental fiction to recognize culture, in Hearst's case, modern, urban, working-class culture, in women's interests. Some women's interests, anyway. Keep looking in the wrong place. Where's my slide? Ah, there it is. This is the thing we know, right? As a group. To our best knowledge, Trotsky neglected to memorize a single page of Hearst's novel, Imitation of Life, published in the Great Depression year of 1933. But it remains her best remembered, an enduring contribution to American racial fantasy. And I wouldn't be surprised if it was the one title by Hearst you had heard of and even read before this afternoon. In fact, I know that some of you have. We've talked about it. Like Harriet Beecher Stowe's Uncle Tom's Cabin, its prototype in maudlin agitation, Imitation of Life is a galling, do-gooding paradox, at once resolutely progressive, paternalistically racist, and gapingly open to anti-racist revisions. Stowe's novel, The Little Something That Sparked the Civil War, bred tenacious stereotypes and ugly minstrel shows, but just as many abolitionist tracts and Black literary classics, for and against, and both. Hearst's imitation generated no social cataclysms. Where's my image? Anyway, but plenty of studio movies, popular telenovelas, postmodern drag shows, late career REM singles, didn't chart that well, and proliferating Black parodies in all genres, caustic and absurd. Anyway, I must have skipped too quickly, but this is the poster, obviously, for the 1959 film version. Henry Louis Gates Jr., another one of my teachers, actually, tracing signifying intertextual chains before hybrid DNA results, has insisted that Imitation of Life is part of the African American canon. That was a PBS joke. Is part of the African American canon. Maybe the most compelling white-authored Black novel ever written. In the form of its 1959 Hollywood film version, he notes, no text was more important to me as a so-called colored child growing up in West Virginia. Multiple memoirs and interviews find Gates relishing the memory of his relatives gathered around the TV whenever Imitation, remade famously by the German director Douglas Sirk as a technicolor, civil rights-tinged soap opera, appeared on The Late Late Show. Everyone in the family circle, still awake when the movie ended, it was early in the morning, found themselves boo-hooing all over the place, that's Gates's language, when the notorious Piola, the light-complexioned, racially passing daughter of dark-skinned Delilah, finally returns to Blackness by crashing her mother's funeral. I'm sorry, Mama, I did love you, cries Piola, embracing the casket authentically, but too late. Importantly, this version of the scene does not appear in Hearst's original novel, which instead abandons Piola in race and mother-denying turpitude and indulges in the empty-headed would-be Black dialect that infects every utterance by and about Delilah, Hearst's awkward attempt to redeem the figure of Aunt Jemima. Yes. Oh, she cast Delilah, Hearst cast Delilah as the novel's presiding working artist. This is an important role for Hurst always. But white tears are the ones jerked here. Like the New Deal reforms Hurst touted while polishing Imitation's draft. I think these two things talk to each other. These tears melt the assumption that her renditions of proletarian solidarity valued Black women's labor and invention. Even so, Gates's definition of imitation of life as a cog in the African American canon isn't just gilding the magnolia or surrendering to privileged Black nostalgia for the ironic best of segregation. That's something that Gates has been accused of. Black literature takes its identity not from the biological or social being of its authors, Gates argued, tilting against the remains of the Black arts movement, but from its intent to build a textual tradition of text-on-text commentary. It becomes Black, so to speak, in its status as grist for later Black books, and its intent to comment, this is Gates's argument, or make that signify, overtly or otherwise, on such books previously linked by textually demonstrable interchanges. By both of these tokens, its inspirations and its upshots, Hurst's melodrama applies for admission into the school of Douglas, Du Bois, and Dove. Okay. An NAACP board member and the most prominent white writer, specifically to volunteer as an ally of the Harlem Renaissance, Fannie helped to pay Zora Neale Hurston's Barnard tuition, unbelievably in certain ways, given how recent this is too. Zora Neale Hurston was the first Black female student at Barnard College, right? We're not far from this, right? From those moments of prevention and repression. Anyway, Fannie helped to pay Zora Neale Hurston's Barnard tuition and briefly employed her as a literary secretary. The two spitballed some of Imitation's plot while Hurston drove them up to Niagara Falls. They both wrote about this incident. A woman on the road adventure that's been compared variously to the travels of Huck and Jim and Thelma and Louise. Hurst, that's a movie joke. Hurst and she and Hurst are shelved back to back in the Olin Library. Their books literally touch each other. I almost cried when I saw that. Anyway, yeah, it's complicated, but you know, in the Olin Library, they're shelved next to each other. Hurston responded with private defenses of the published novel. Her public engagements were more conflicted, much more conflicted, including her playfully anthropological story, 1942 Story in Harlem Slang, and I know some of you have read that. We read it in a Harlem Renaissance class together, in whose glossary Piola is defined as a general noun for a quote-unquote very white Negro girl. Langston Hughes, another Harlem friend of Hurst's, met Invitation with a typically cagey blend of graciousness and satire. He informed Fannie that the initial 1935 film rendering of Imitation was the first serious screen treatment of the Negro problem in America. Hurst loved that, right? But he also then rewrote it as the comic target of his short 1938 play, Limitations of Life. That's good. Okay. In Hughes's lampoon, the racial tables are turned, and a pretty blonde maid waits on a grand Black lady, clad in the somewhat Hurstian attire of a trailing evening gown, a tiara, and a large Metropolitan Opera program. She liked to do first nights. She was a big first nighter. The most pointed post-imitation of all, Toni Morrison's 1970 debut novel, The Bluest Eye, I bet some of you read that, features a protagonist named Pecola, one C more than Piola, who is haunted by Hurst texts, along with her hunger for clipped white features and sapphire eyes. Pecola, wasn't that the name of the girl in Imitation of Life? This is Morrison's language. Asks a new neighbor who meaningfully arrives with, quote, her long black hair braided into two lynch ropes, end quote. Morrison's book draws Hurst into its Black Ohio world to demonstrate Imitation's antagonism to Black life. Talking back to Hurston and Hughes's responses in the bargain, it signifies on the great white Black American novel to suggest that signifying should stick to less deathly material. I didn't read a word of Imitation of Life before Henry Louis Gates landed temporarily, it was very temporarily, in Durham to teach a graduate course on Black women's writing that I was lucky enough to take. When I'm asked by myself and others to account for my own hope to speak to African American literature, notice I've stuffed that in the end, but anyway, names other than Hurst's rush in. They include those of my father, a civil rights marcher who had served in a newly integrated U.S. Army unit in Korea, and who later enjoyed bailing radical students out of jail. I'm open to that as well. And my mother, particularly with Julia's help, but anyway, and my mother, who arranged our move to the Black and Jewish Manhattan suburb of Teaneck, New Jersey, the first town in America to vote to integrated school system. There were other integrated towns before, but it voted, in a majority to integrate its own school system when we hit the middle class. Just as crucial are the names of the African American teachers I've had the gift of learning from for more than 50 years. Mrs. Theodora Lacey, an organizer of the Montgomery bus boycott. She was young, but she was involved in basic planning for that successful boycott. She resettled in a 6th grade science classroom in Teaneck, and she was my science teacher and my homeroom teacher. Billy Batson, you don't know these folks, but Billy Batson, we're Facebook friends. Okay. Billy Batson, Abe Fogel, Karen Palmer, and Jacob Tanji, young musicians with whom I traded bass lines and harmonies in school orchestras and rock bands, sometimes at the same time. Amiri Baraka, who spent a year at Columbia outlining the material matrix of the Black canon in natty tweed suits and a red, black, and green rep tie. The suits changed, but the tie was always there. The aforementioned Skip Gates, who made the wise decision to miss my dissertation defense, this is true, to attend Toni Morrison's Nobel Prize ceremony in Old Stockholm. He signed it, but he tore the page out of, never mind. I have no regrets. Okay, well, not about that. All right, Carla Holloway at Duke. Some of us here worked with Carla Holloway at Duke, and J. Lee Green at UNC Chapel Hill, who gallantly stepped in, and then some when Gates stepped out. My senior colleagues here at WashU, Gerald Early, you know him, the one and only, and Rafia Zafar, who I dearly miss, now living her New York dream down the street from the Riverside Drive apartment where Ralph Ellison sweated for decades to top Invisible Man. She's very aware of that, right? I think she's in her happy place, She misses us a little, though. I know this for a fact. I hear from friends. Okay, I list just these names. There are more, and can't help but marvel at my incredible string of classroom luck, right? What a set. I shake my head when estimating the incalculable benefits of desegregated education to white Americans of my generation. We forget this. It's insane that we do, right? Excuse me. Benefits now slurred, detruthed, and disappeared by American fascists. And I wonder, given the power of my models, how I could have become anything other than the flawed but eager apostle of their teaching I turned out to be. Where's that slide? Oh, there she is again. Okay. We really are at the end. Drinks are coming. Okay. But back at last to the teachings of Fannie Hurst. Despite the unforgivable inflections of imitation of life, I think she knew this much, that all of us Americans are forever locked in interracial exchanges, heated and enlightened, freeing and wounding and frequently unequal, and that we in our country are the combined stuff these exchanges are made of. Her perception leads me to this closing judgment, which I hope we've both earned. The flood of white ally literature, I was interested in that, as you might imagine. The flood of white ally literature that supplied the racial reckoning of 2020 gets what counts wrong. Robin DiAngelo's White Fragility, for one, a book which misstates the Emancipation Proclamation, grasps that white liberal guilt is itself a form of white indulgence, a self-regarding emotional set that protects racial inequality. Her identity-sealing prescriptivism, however, proceeds on the assumption that the beginning of anti-racist wisdom for white Americans is admitting that interracial experience has had no real effect on their self-constitution. Whiteness alone rules there, as it does in post-DEI Washington, D.C. But this just isn't so. All of my best teachers saw this. Fannie Hurst sometimes saw this, right? Even the least redeemable characters in Imitation of Life see this, and I've seen it again and again, or so I pray. I am in part what the genius of Black American expression has made me, and so are you, whoever you are. In accepting the title of Fannie Hurst Professor, I'd like to think that my own teaching and scholarship reflect this truth. African American literature is, among many other local and global things, the common matter of American literature, American life, and American selves. One of our shared obligations as custodians of a profoundly threatened, still necessary multiracial democracy, forever delayed but always becoming, is to cultivate that fact. Okay, now let's get a drink. Okay. Thank you. All right.
Boy, what a fascinating presentation. I don't know what I can say. I was kind of thinking, sitting there, maybe someday I will just use my WashU employee tuition benefit and enroll myself in one of Bill's classes. That's that will help contribute to your skyrocketing majors, right? So. All right. Well, I also want to thank all of you for joining us today. So this concludes the formal portion of today's ceremony. And I would say that what may surpass the speakers today, Bill, Gerald, and Abraham, will be the food and drinks out there. Thanks so much.